next, we turn our attention to the challenges to the liberal order, to those countries that in this age of anxiety, in this interwar period, chose alternatives to liberal capitalism, that really repudiated in one way or another the principles of liberal capitalism. First, we look at the communist alternative. We know that communism was established in Russia when, in 1917, Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, defeated the Mensheviks, and then was the dictatorship of the proletariat was declared. Okay? Remember, the proletariat was this new class that, according to the theorists of socialism, Marx and Engels, was the class that didn't own anything except their children. They were the industrial workers who had left the countryside, and whatever they might have owned, whatever little they might have owned, some of them might have owned there, and had become basically appendages, manpowering the factories of the industrial era. The proletarian class that was believed to be a new revolutionary class, and at least in the scientific theories of socialism promulgated by Marx and Engels. And it was believed that once this proletarian revolution would happen in one country, that all the other countries, especially the industrialized countries, including, say, Germany, Northern Italy, France, England, that they would follow, that there would be a domino effect to this first initial proletarian revolution. Obviously, we know now that that domino effect did not happen. So, in fact, the whole dynamic of the creation of a socialist society became contained within Russia. So within that arena, we had basically two groups: the communists, or Reds, and then the anti-communists, or Whites. So the Bolsheviks execute the Tsar and his family. They remember the French Revolution, where the revolutionaries tried to keep the king alive, but then it didn't work out. So they just proceeded to execute the Tsar. And then also they executed about 200,000 people who were perceived as enemies, say potential allies of the Tsar, people who could have revived the old regime, or that in any way would have been an obstacle to the creation of a communist state. So then, in the early years, when still the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was being negotiated, and the effects of the war were really still all too present in Russian life, and and the landscapes and cultural landscapes. So this is the era of war communism. It's still an era of civil war where the dust hasn't settled from the revolution, really. And so at this time, all private property becomes national property. So all private property is nationalized. Now the state owns everything. Okay. After a few years under the leadership of Lenin, there is an understanding that this is a bit of an exaggeration. And so, and at once the Russian Communist Party, its power is consolidated, there is something called NEP, or New Economic Policy. This is implemented under the leadership of Lenin, and it's a program of a controlled market economy. So the market economy comes back, but in small proportions and under control. That's the new economic policy. Eventually, Lenin dies in 1924, and so the problem of replacing him comes to the fore. And there are basically two contenders: Trotsky and Stalin. Okay. Trotsky, of these two, Trotsky is the one that really represents the ideas of internationalist communism. The important thing is for the revolution to expand, because if we don't expand, we're going to collapse. That's what Trotsky feels. However, he becomes exiled when Stalin sort of becomes more dominant, and then eventually he is killed while in exile in Mexico. So Stalin, who is actually from the south of Russia, the area of Georgia, feels that, what is left to do is a communism in one country. If we want to build communism, this is where we're supposed to build it. So let's get to that. So Stalin feels that that Russia needs an industrial economy to even be able to sustain a communist system. And this is in alignment, after all, with the theories of Marx and Engels, who believed that if there is a proletarian class, if there is a class of industrial workers, that's the revolutionary class that then will sustain the transition toward communism. So it makes somewhat sense that Stalin would be preoccupied with bringing Russia into the industrial age. And how does he do that? He does it through the famous 5-year plans. These were plans that projected the economic development for the next 5 years. And everybody had to align to the pace and the agenda that was produced by the central government. This is also called democratic centralism, in the sense that it is democratic because it includes everyone. Everyone has to go at the pace of the government, but it's also very centralized. So the government is the economy. And the priorities of Stalin are creating an industrial base, create a collective agriculture, and then have a stronger military power. So those are his priorities. Who is in the way of achieving these goals is, for example, the wealthy peasants. There were wealthy peasants in Russia. They were called kulakis. And in the new economic policy of Lenin, they were given a certain space for a market economy. If they had excess agricultural product, they could sell it, for example. But with the collectivization of all agriculture that Stalin imposes, the mandate is collectivize or perish. You don't want to give us our lands? Okay, we will chop off your head. And that's how actually about 3 million kulakis perished under Stalinist rule. Eventually, of course, killing all these people doesn't make you a lot of friends, but it could rather make you some enemies. And so Stalin became very preoccupied with enemies he might have had in his own cabinet, or even among the leading intellectuals of his time. He ended up purging about 90% of his own cabinet, all people who were executed, eliminated. And this is the period of the big deportations towards Siberia. About 8 million people were deported. And another estimate of 3 million were actually demoted from whatever positions they had because they were suspected as enemies. So you can see that in a sort of centralized democratic centralism, might achieve certain goals through the 5 years plans, but the price is quite high. Nonetheless, Stalin continued to rule the Soviet Union well beyond World War II. Okay, then we have another alternative, and this is known as the fascist alternative. And it, in this understanding, fascism, the word fascist would apply both to the fascist regime in Italy and also the Nazi regime in Germany, because they have many common characteristics. Okay, what is this fascist alternative to liberal capitalism, to this idea that capitalism regulates itself? Well, the fascist alternative was very appealing to people who were conservatives, or even people who were middle class, and people who were part of the rural population that wasn't that close to the industries based in the cities. So these people perceived fascism as a bulwark to the possible spread of communism. Remember, the internationalist idea of communism was that it was going to be this domino effect. And there were many proletarians in these industrialized countries who were waiting for that domino effect. They said, when is the revolution coming here? Are we going to be in action about it? So a lot of people became preoccupied with that. And that gave, the fascist alternative a certain effect, because it met the needs of some people that were preoccupied with the spread of socialism. So in a way, the fascist alternative presents the characteristics of a sort of ultra-nationalism, a nationalism that has become a little excessive, put it that way. So it involves often the veneration of a leader. It involves a great dosage of ethnocentrism, we are better than everybody else, and a certain dosage of militarism. Okay. This ultranationalism is also hostile to liberal democracies, which it perceives as really having failed or being too weak, and very hostile to communism. Okay, so we see manifestations of this ultranationalism in Italy with Mussolini and in Germany with Hitler. So it is really a way to govern that is heavily based in ethnocentrism and xenophobia. Everybody who is not like us must be bad, and we have all the right answers, and we are the ones who do it right. So first we look at Italian fascism. Okay, we have to remember precisely that Italy, especially northern Italy, where the industrial base of the nation was located, had a proletarian class. There were factory workers in those regions, and many of them were very inspired by what they heard was happening in Russia. In fact, I remember a song that says, "And we will do like the Russians. Those who don't work won't have anything to eat." That was the idea, that by redistributing the means of production, everybody would reap off the benefits of their own labor, and there wouldn't be the parasitic people who didn't work but ate very well. So there was that factor in Italian society at the end of World War, these echoes from the Soviet Union and its revolution. And then there was what is often known as irredentism. We remember that Italy was initially part of the Central Powers allied with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then when it did enter the war in 1915, it actually entered on the other side with England and France, based on the promise that this alliance would reward the nation with a completion of its territorial unification, with certain areas that were ethnically and culturally Italian, especially at the border with Yugoslavia, that would then be integrated with the territory of the nation. And because Italy didn't obtain exactly what it wanted, then many people felt, we fought this war, but we didn't get what we expected. So these two were the main factors of malcontent and instability in the constitutional monarchy that had unified the country. So then this sort of movement, this participatory movement of fascism started to form. These were the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento. So these were veterans of the war that congregated in this association. And what did they do? They purged people who were believed to be communists. They gave them castor oil, which makes you go to the bathroom very quickly. And then they also did the same treatment with unionists and labor. So they really scared people about, their aspiration for a socialist revolution, for example. And of course, the constitutional monarchy was not too unhappy about that, because, if there would have been a socialist revolution, the first to go would have been the constitutional monarchy. So eventually, in 1922, we have to remember that fascism as a dictatorship in Italy is longer than Nazism in Germany, because it starts about 1 decade earlier. In 1922, Mussolini organized the March on Rome. With this march, he basically eliminated the parliament. The fascists believed that the parliament was too weak, and they proved it when they eliminated it. And then the king, instead of saying, well, that was the parliament, we should perhaps continue to have it, the king felt that, told Mussolini, yes, you can eliminate all this stuff and you can become the prime minister. So we see this alliance between the constitutional monarchy, who really abdicates almost his constitutional part to confer power to Mussolini. In fact, in the first decade, fascism is intent in centralizing its power, one-party dictatorship, in eliminating dissenters, either through exile or confinement or assassination or both. Confinement was a way of implementing internal forms of exile. You would send a person who was suspect of not being aligned with the ideology of fascism to, say, a small island where this person wouldn't be able to operate as an agent of transformation, or a small town in the Apennine Mountains, somewhere where they would be isolated. Then it managed to revive the imperial sentiments from the memories of ancient Rome and its power in the Mediterranean. And last but not least, it displayed a focus on public works. So that, again, for example, certain areas that were still marshes became farming land. So it did a certain amount of public works in the same way that, say, the New Deal did. Works that employed people and that created infrastructure. Now we look at the rise of German nationalist socialism. We know that Germany had a very substantial industrial base. So the impact of the Depression was proportional to how much this industrial base was significant in the overall economy. So in Germany, the impact of the Depression was very severe. So clearly there was a lot of malcontent. How could people be happy when their salary wasn't enough to go to the market and buy a chicken? So Hitler proposed himself as somebody who could remedy this in very xenophobic ways. For example, he started to use propaganda to really attribute all the blame for the experiences that German people were having to a minority that existed in all European countries, to the Jews. They were the ones who hoarded all the money. They were the bankers, the money lenders, and all this sort of economic depression was their fault. And also, he became intent in gradually destroying what Nazists and fascists perceive as a weak form of government, namely democracy. Democracy is not, doesn't believe in strong leadership. It believes in things that evolve gradually, and that makes it weak and something that is better to get rid of. So in 1933 is where really culminates his taking over of power. In a way, there was a state of emergency given by the fact that the situation was out of control with the rampant inflation, etc. So he again went for a one-party dictatorship, the dictatorship of the Nationalist Socialist Party, which then was abbreviated as Nazi. What did this party do? Eliminate all unions, forbid strikes, and also lockouts, purge the judiciary and the police and civil service of all those people suspect of different ideas. So at this point, the road was open for what is known as the racial state. Okay, so what is the racial state? It's a state that upholds the purity and the superiority of the Aryan race and reorganized things accordingly. There was a claiming of an ancestry for the German people, and to these ancestors, the Aryans, who were people of light skin color, blue eyes, certain physical characteristics, and were believed to be superior. Since very early times, the first Aryan invasions actually date from the era before the Christian era. So there was this reclaiming of this ancestry, this noble ancestry, for the portion of the German people that were of that descent. And therefore, everything else became, scapegoated, marginalized, or persecuted. Those, for example, who were of Jewish origin. And then there was a reconfiguration of civil life according to this concept. For example, women who in the years before the Great Depression in Germany had acquired the right to vote lost it. Women were encouraged to give birth. The top happiness for a woman, according to Nazi ideology, was to give birth to many young men who were going to become soldiers. The Jews, who were very present in German society, they were a significant part of the population, were marginalized, they were purged, they were executed, and eventually they were deported. So they lost their basis of power and their participation and their ways to participate in the economy. And then also very rampant elimination of the weak and the diverse. For example, physical disability was considered like a liability for the state. We can't afford these people. They cannot carry their own weight, so let's eliminate them. The ideology of racial state was, we need to reproduce the purity of the race. We need more people who represent that's racial purity, more Aryan children, Aryan generations. So obviously people who were gay, who were not intent in reproducing the race, were also eliminated, marginalized. The mentally ill also, they represented this flaw, something that didn't work with their mind, so they were just a waste of time. And also the other people who were otherwise racially diverse, like the Jews and other minorities. So that was one of the important priorities of the racial state. So we remember just one episode of this. In 1938 is the famous Kristallnacht, when the practice of pogroms began. Pogrom is a Yiddish word that means devastation. So basically during this night, big raids occurred in all the Jewish homes, stores, and families and neighborhoods. So what is then known, or becomes known as the Holocaust, begins in fact with these pogroms of devastation, nighttime devastation of the lives of those people who were not aligned with the racial state. Yes, we are now coming to the third chapter of part 7 of our global history textbook, Traditions and Encounters. The second volume includes part 7, which focuses on the 20th century. And this third chapter in that part is entitled Nationalisms and Political Identities in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So the focus of the chapter is the same interwar period as in the previous chapter, The Age of Anxiety. But now the perspective is on the bioregions of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We look at these bioregions in the context of their functions as seats of the plantation economies that powered the world's industrial production systems, and of their transitions from colonies to nation states. These transitions, we remember, happens at a time when the European leadership has lost steam in the world affairs as a result of the awareness generated by World War I. So we basically look at Asia, Africa, and then Latin America. Within Asia, our focus will be on China, India, and then Japan. Within Africa, we look at the overarching effects of the Africans being affected by World War I and the African nationalisms that emerged from that. Within Latin America, we look at the impact of World War I and the impact of the Great Depression, and also at the effects of the economic imperialism of the United States, whether or not this new imperialist power behaved like a good neighbor. So when we look at the Asian paths to autonomy, we observe that the Great War had the effect of disseminating the ideals of independence and national unity among the people of Asia, because they participated in the war and because many of their leading intellectuals were educated in Europe at a time when these ideals were prominent in European cultural discourses. So in a way, in seeking new identities, these nations adapt ideologies such as nationalism and socialism to fit their indigenous traditions. It is a period of disorder from which then a new order is going to emerge. When we look at India, we observe in this period the quest for home rule. Okay. There was an intellectual elite in India that was educated in Great Britain and therefore had absorbed the ideals of democracy, freedom, and equality. These intellectuals animated the National Congress of India, which gained strength in the after World War I, as a result of the war effort. It encountered repression and violence from the rule of Great Britain. In this period, the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi emerged. Mahatma Gandhi was born in 1869 and died in 1949. Mahatma means great soul. We must remember that Mahatma Gandhi had been living in South Africa for 22 years, where he had learned a lot about colonial disputes and struggles and wars between the colonial elites and the mainland. What he advocated was a peaceful revolt based on the principle of ahimsa, which is part of the Indian philosophical tradition and means nonviolence. So there were two ways to protest. One was non-cooperation and the other one was civil disobedience. What were the aspirations? What was the India that Mahatma Gandhi envisioned? It was an India where the injustices of the caste system would be eradicated, so that, for example, the untouchables, who were the lowest caste at that time, would be seen as children of God. And of course, during this period, occasional violence erupted, and it was duly repressed. Eventually, in 1937, the British Crown emanated the India Act. This act was designated India as a self-governing state, but not really as an independent nation. Eventually, the India Act turned out not to work, partly due to internal tensions between two big sections of the Indian population, the Hindus, who were the majority, and the Muslims, who were a minority. Many Muslims were peasants who turned out to be indebted due to the depression, and so they were afraid that the India Act would empower the Hindus to marginalize them even further. It is at this time that the first proposal for two states came to the attention, and the second state being what we know today as Pakistan. Pakistan means the state of the pure Muslims. So as we leave India, we turn to China. In China, we have a search for order. Okay, and here we have map 1 that shows us how, in fact, the Qing dynasty had been through a period of many agitations. It really was aware that it wasn't capable of handling China anymore in the modern world. And so the last emperor, who was a child, abdicated in 1911 due to a revolt. So then we have the period of the Republic, which is a very unstable period dominated by warlords. Eventually, after World War I, two different parties become more defined. The Chinese nationalists under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen have a program of resurrecting the nation from its decline. Sun Yat-sen dies in 1925, and his successor, Chiang Kai-shek, becomes the leader of the Kuomintang, or the People's Party. In the meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party is founded by a very young Mao Zedong. This party looks to the Soviet Union for leadership. How can we implement some Marxist reforms into China? So eventually we have the period of the Civil War, during which the nationalists and the communists contend the leadership of the nation. And this culminates in the Long March. It's a march across the country led by the Communist Party to establish presence, to overcome obstacles, and to establish a base for this party in northwest China, and to figure out ways to adapt Marxist-Leninist ideas to China, thus forming what we know as Maoism. Okay. Finally, we look at Japan. In Japan we know is the most imperialist and also the most industrialized at this point of the Asian economies. So it is also more directly affected by the Depression, which causes a lot of social unrest, which is eventually repressed by a return to militarism. So Japan is basically at a fork. Is it going to become part of the international capitalist order, or is it going to focus on its domination of Asia and its economies? Eventually, it seems like the second hypothesis prevails, because in 1931, Japan invades Manchuria, the Chinese part of Manchuria. Okay. Then we shift the focus to Africa. How is Africa affected by the Great War? It is impacted in at least two significant ways. One is because the people of Africa, the young men of Africa, are drafted in the troops together with the armies of their colonial mainland, or their respective colonial mainlands. And because their territories turn into battlefields between colonial contenders, as in, for example, Germany, that really contended for predominance in both Togo and Cameroon. So in a way, the Great War for Africans is a lesson in how to challenge the European authorities with their own ideas. At the same time, the colonial economy is suffering from the Great Depression because excessive taxes that often help colonial powers pay for their war expenses are visited on farmers, who then have to abandon their lands, thus giving ways to more plantations. And because the infrastructure that is being created by the colonial power is designed to serve the plantation economies, but really being focuses on exports. So in a way, there is the occupation of the African territory results in the extortion of compulsory labor from Africans who have lost their lands and therefore work in plantations now. It cannot be too surprising that African nationalisms emerge at this time. There is a new elite that is also educated in Europe, and they have absorbed the ideas that circulate in European cultural discourse. So African nationalism at this time, especially under the leadership of the Jamaican Marcus Garvey, looks at this vision of a Pan-Africanism. In a way, the Pan-Africanists want to return to a pre-European Africa, to Africa the way it was before the Europeans appeared, which is a bit of a utopian, because in fact the Muslims had already made inroads into Africa before the Europeans. They also were preoccupied with controlling African women who might be attracted by foreigners. And also, they had this utopian ideal of a single African state, When we turn to looking at what's happening in Latin America, we see the struggles with neocolonialism in this bioregion. We know that the effects of the Monroe Doctrine are that the Monroe Doctrine ends up encouraging the imperialism of the U.S. in the new Western Hemisphere. The Great Depression affects the economies of Mexico and Cuba, for example, which opens the way to the influence of socialist ideas. These alternatives become known. And this influence is visible in many of the artistic movements of the time. For example, the muralistas, painters in Mexico, their movement exemplifies the desire for a popular socialist reform, for a democracy, a participatory democracy, and also for creating elective families where the female leadership in the arts and other forms of expression is respected. But, of course, the U.S. traders wanted to control the traffic of oil. So the economic imperialism of the U.S. stifles the development of a diversified economy. If everybody has to be focused on extracting enough oil for the extractive industries of the U.S., who is going to, design development for industry, civil industry, or even agricultural production? So we see that, in fact, this desire to control the oil trade is the motivation behind the many military interventions of the U.S. in Central America at this period. And these interventions are reflected in map 2 for this chapter. Finally, during the period of the New Deal, with Roosevelt at the leadership of the New Deal economy in the U.S., there is a softer policy. At this time, Lázaro Cárdenas nationalizes the Mexican oil industry. In 1938, he nationalizes the oil industry of Mexico. And this is the first example of the idea of a popular national leadership in an ex-colony that keeps the resources of the nation's territory within that territory and for the people of that territory. We will see many other examples. And to Roosevelt's credit, we can observe that he resisted the demands of the big business and respected the nationalization of Lázaro Cárdenas, thus getting the U.S. to behave like a good neighbor for once. So we now come to the 4th chapter of Part 7. Part 7 being the part of our brief global history dedicated to understanding the events of the 20th century that just ended as they evolved in the global realignments that we observe today. And chapter 4 being the chapter of this part dedicated to World War II. The chapter is entitled New Conflagration, and conflagration it is indeed. Many people used to refer to World War I as the Great War, perhaps imagining that humanity would never produce a war bigger than World War I. Unfortunately, this is far from the truth, because World War II was, in a way, in the results, in the devastation it visited upon people, much, much bigger than World War I. With a war that really lasted for 5 years, 6 years, and with a balance of casualties estimated at about 60 million, many of whom were soldiers, but many were civilians, and many were victims of genocide. With the first and hopefully last time when a weapon of mass destruction as powerful as the atomic bomb was used for military purpose on Japan. And we can say that the results of this magnitude of this devastation, never known before, resulted in expanding that sense of anxiety that had characterized the mode of European culture in the period between the wars to a global scale. Why did this anxiety expand? Because with World War II, humanity became aware of how dangerous we are, how dangerous we can be to our own species, to other species, and to life as a whole. So before we actually get into looking at how at the escalation that led to the explosion of the conflict in Europe in 1939, let's look for a moment at the military alliances that were in place before that happened. We know that especially over the 30s, a very strong alliance evolved in the area of Central Europe between Germany to the north and Italy to the south. In Germany, in the 30s, the Nazi regime took power, and it sort of dismantled the democratic system that was in place before, and fascism that really grew in Italy in the previous decade had a similar effect on the constitutional monarchy that existed there. Okay, so that the alliance between Nazi Germany and fascist Italy was the axis that formed within Europe. And then the third ally that the Axis had in Asia was Japan. We have to interrogate what is it that these countries had in common? How come they became allied? Why did they feel that there was something to be allied about? Perhaps beyond the aberrant regimes that they had, but that doesn't explain everything. So these three, Germany, Italy, and Japan, were industrialized nations that had some aspirations to becoming empires, at least in their own region. They were also countries where a militarized form of a racial state had prevailed. As we have seen in Germany and Italy, these dictatorships had overthrown the democratic system, and in Japan, democratization had never happened anyway. So there were countries that were neutral in the conflict, and these included Sweden, Spain, Switzerland, and in Asia, India. Obviously, Great Britain and France were allied in defending the principles of democracy, and eventually a very useful ally that they found was the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, the political practice was what Stalin called democratic centralism, but it was very centralized, as we have seen, so the democratic part was not very strong. Another factor that led up to the conflagration is that these countries were building strong arsenals. We know that Stalin, was one of his priorities in the 5 years plan was industrialization in the sense of military industrialization, growing a strong army, developing a strong army. Germany, Nazi Germany, was completely devoted to developing a strong army, and the United States always did its part in being a strong military nation. So now we can look at the steps that lead to the explosion of the conflict of World War II. First, we observed that in 1931, the German army invades Manchuria and commits many human rights violations in that region, especially against women. Then we observed that in 1933, Nazi Germany implements the racial laws, and that fascist Italy follows suit. Mostly in Germany, the racial laws were applied against the Jewish minority that at this point becomes completely excluded from civil life and from social life. And in Italy, actually, the racial laws are more applied in the African colonies that Italy had at that time. Then there is a military step that Hitler takes, and it's known as the Anschluss. Anschluss in German means annexation. And southeast of Germany, there's a country called Austria. And the people of Austria happen to speak the same language as people of Germany, German. So according to certain idealistic nation, certain idealistic ideas of the nation, the people who have a similar language are part of the same nation. So that ideologically justified the Anschluss, according to Hitler. And at that time, the governments of the democracies of Europe wanted to perhaps maintain the peace a bit longer, if possible. They practiced the politics of appeasement. If Hitler wants Austria, let him have Austria. We're not going to war over Austria. Eventually, though, Hitler turned to the region of the Sudeten, which is a region of Czechoslovakia. At that point, also, the leadership in England had changed from Lord Chamberlain, who was the prime minister, then Winston Churchill becomes prime minister. And he has a different perspective on Hitler. He realizes that this is a threat. That the values are so different that one has to be in action about it. On the other hand, there's also Stalin, who is, the chief dictator in the Soviet Union, and is a politician astute enough to understand that that Hitler can constitute a major threat even to Russia. We remember that geographically between the east boundary of Germany and Russia, there is Poland. Poland is a vast land, a vast nation, but it is not very defensible because it doesn't have natural boundaries, as in, say, a mountain chain, like, the Alps. So, Stalin is aware of the vulnerability of Russia from a threat that may come from the West, namely from Germany. And so he offers an alliance, makes an offer of possible alliance to Great Britain and France. But at that point, Great Britain and France are not really willing to become allies of what they perceive another aberration of democracy, like a country that has gone socialist. And so eventually Stalin, for his own self-protection and for protection of his country, signs the famous non-aggression pact with Hitler. Okay. So at this point, the Nazi army knows that there will be no aggression from the East Front. So it turns itself toward the West Front, and here we can see map number 1 for this chapter. And in what is known as a blitzkrieg, like blitzkrieg means a flash war, basically the Nazi army occupies Paris, it occupies all the north part of France, and installs in the remaining part, the south part, a puppet government, a government that collaborates with the occupants in North France. This happens in 1940, and it is a shock for all people in Europe, because France had always had this leadership role in in culture, in civilization, also in implementing revolutions and democracies. It had always been seen as the country that people refer to for certain values that they could look up to. So the fact that the whole democratic system of France is dismantled by an invading army from Germany is very shocking for all Europeans, and also, of course, for Great Britain. And of course, Hitler then has to think, what is going to be next? And the leadership of the Nazi army considers Great Britain, but then they realize that with England being an island, it would be perhaps not strategically not the smart thing to do at that point. So they decide instead to go east, to go toward Poland and the regions of Eastern Europe that sit between Germany and Russia. So they decide to go for that. And of course, Poland, as we have seen, is a vast expanse of land. So that gives them room also to create another weapon that was used at that time, namely the space to build the concentration camps where eventually the Nazi army deported a large part of the Jewish population of Europe from many different countries, all the countries occupied by Nazi forces, and also other dissenters, people who were Rom or Gypsies, people who were suspected of being socialists, and people who were suspected of being gay. Some of these groups, of course, overlapped because many Jews were socialists and some probably might have been gay. So there was a mixture of people, but anyone who was perceived as non-aligned with the regime that the Nazis were imposing was liable of being deported to these concentration camps. Next, of course, Hitler wants to expand even more. So at this point, the non-aggression pact with Stalin is moot in his mind. And so in the spring of 1941, he begins the Operation Barbarossa, which is basically Hitler's Russian campaign. So Hitler, like Napoleon, over 1 century earlier, decides to invade Russia. And like his predecessor, this decision results ultimately in his defeat. Here again, we need to focus a little bit on the geophysicality of war. How does actually, the earth and its regions, the different regions where wars take place, affect the dynamics of the wars themselves. We have to remember that the Russian winter is very cold. And a typical posture of the Russian army, if there is an invasion in the spring, is, oh, okay, come in, welcome. We are not going to stop you. Come in. But then, eventually, when the winter comes, the weather, the cold of the Russian winter will defeat this invading army, even if the Russian army doesn't do that. And that is what happened, exactly what happened to Napoleon, and what happens to the Nazi army as well. Over 100,000 Nazi soldiers were affected with frostbite during the Russian winter, and more than 2,000 were actually suffered amputations. On the other hand, the United States gets to hear about these these problems, these dangers, and has the goodwill to provide the Red Army with 13 million pairs of felt boots that help keep the feet of the Red Army soldiers attached to their legs. And in addition to that, we have to understand that for the Red Army was made of people from Russia, and people from Russia are accustomed to dealing with very long and very cold winters. So they know automatically what one has to do to protect oneself from the climate. And so do the people of these regions. So eventually we see that the city of Stalingrad, which is a city of southeast Russia, named after the political leader Stalin, mounts a resistance that really is organic, a resistance to the Nazi invasion that is organic from the people of the city, the people of the region, and the Red Army. And this resistance is so organic and so integrated that eventually in 1942, the Nazi army has to retreat, and actually the Red Army can go to the offensive eventually much later, getting actually to Berlin. So here we see the manifestation of three very important tropes that we need to understand the dynamics of this war. We have to remember it's a war that lasted for about 6 years of very bloody battles, and that involved everyone, the armies, the civilian population, the lands. So no one really was exempt. Animals. So the three important tropes are occupation, collaboration, and resistance. We see how the Nazi army really, occupies almost every country that there is in Europe, except that it doesn't, get to stay in Russia. So the people of these occupied regions have a choice of either collaborating with the occupying army or resisting the occupying army, or both. In fact, most people have to do both, because collaborating with an occupying army, or at least pretending to do so, is often what keeps your head on your shoulders And at the same time, many people feel that they have to organize in groups, brigades, networks that oppose resistance to this occupation. And so this becomes really an important trope, the trope of resistance, that ultimately helps is just as powerful, perhaps, as armies can be, as formal armies, in defeating the aggressiveness of the Nazi army. And one of the examples really comes from Germany's main ally in Europe, Italy. What happens in Italy? The Balkan, the front of the Balkan, in the alliance, the Italian fascist army is assigned to the Balkan, to the region of the Balkans, to really offset whatever resistance there is to the Axis in that area. It performs very poorly, and this causes a certain loss of trust in this ally in the Nazi army, because they say, look what we do, we subjugate all of France and Poland, and you can't even handle the Balkans. What kind of ally are you? So there is a loss of trust, and so the Nazi army sends more occupying military into the Italian territory. And of course, the Italian people are not very happy about that. And eventually, understanding that that the Italian fascist army is really facing a defeat in the Balkans, the king demotes Mussolini. He puts General Badoglio in charge of the army, and then he asks the Great Britain and France for an armistice. He wants out of the war. Okay, and General Badoglio dismisses the army, because now this army is pointless. The country has changed sides and wants not only out of the army, but also wants peace with the former enemies. And so this frees all these young men who were part of the Italian fascist army, who were conscripted in this army, to really form the base of the networks of resistance groups and partisans that eventually help the allies, the Great Britain, the soldiers from Great Britain, France and the United States, when they arrive in the southern part of Italy eventually, and liberate the country, advancing from the south the way that Garibaldi had done about a century earlier. So but this doesn't just happen in Italy. In Italy, perhaps it's more blatant, because there is this period of civil war from 43 to 45, when in fact the only people who know what to do are the partisans and the people who work in the resistance movement. But this happens in France, it happens in Poland, it happens in all the territories occupied by the Nazi army, and it is really a big help to the formal armies that eventually defeat Nazi Germany.